debate in Brazil is no longer about projects or ideas. This is a deep crisis. Can there be democracy without the rule of law? Brazil is witnessing the collapse of its institutions and public policies. It won't be able to meet the 2030 goals for the UN Sustainable Development Goals, such as the eradication of poverty, of hunger, access to education, gender equality, access to water and energy, and reduced inequalities. The young Brazilian democracy shows its fragility, and it has been at stake since the rise of Jair Bolsonaro to the power. The country's destiny remains an open question. The dismantlement of the rule of law is led by a president that despises the rights of his role, promotes hatred and minority attacks. Indigenous peoples are one of his main targets. Since his campaign, he's promised access to indigenous lands for mining and agribusiness companies. Along with Trump's government policies, he's willing to make his son, Deputy Eduardo Bolsonaro, the Brazilian ambassador in the US. His intention is to find investors to exploit our resources in indigenous lands. Since his inauguration, illegal mining has soared. BBC News Brazil published an article on the destruction caused by illegal mining in the Amazon since Bolsonaro became president. The activity was monitored in 3 of the Brazilian indigenous lands that suffer the most with illegal gold mining: Caiapó and Munduruku in Pará, and Yanomami in Roraima and Amazonas. Together, the 3 territories occupy an area equivalent to the state of São Paulo and also have some of the most well-preserved Amazon regions. Indigenous people and environmentalists blame this escalation observable in part of Pará and Roraima to statements by President Jair Bolsonaro in favor of mining in indigenous lands and what they see as a relaxation in governmental actions against environmental crimes. There's a warlike atmosphere in the Amazon. The Wajapi people in the state of Amapá were attacked in their own land by armed miners in the end of July. The UN condemned the death of an indigenous leader and pressured Bolsonaro to abandon the project to authorize the exploitation of those areas. The press worldwide reported the attack to the Wajapi. The death of the indigenous leader made the headlines of the most important newspapers in the world. Reporters of the Brazilian show Fantástico traveled to Roraima to check on denunciations of illegal mining in the region. They went to a Yanomami Indigenous Reserve, and as they flew above the area, they registered miles and miles of riverbanks ravaged by illegal mining. Indigenous leaders believe that about 20,000 illegal miners are working on protected areas. Amid the economic crisis, mining has become even more important strategically for the president, once it represents 4% of the Brazilian GDP. As Bolsonaro seeks ways of expanding mining activities, the death toll of the Brazilian mineral model rises. Over the last years, 2 crimes committed by Vale, the country's largest mining company, killed 20 people in Mariana and over 300 in Brumadinho. They also destroyed river basins of the Doce and Paraopeba rivers. Both tragedies involve the burst of iron ore reject dams in the state of Minas Gerais. Presently, there are more than 30 other dams at risk of burst. And there's practically no inspection as the government made cuts on the budget of the Brazilian Mining Agency. 2019 can be considered the record year for the poisoning of food. Since Bolsonaro took office, 290 new pesticides were approved for use in the country. According to the UN, pesticides respond for 200,000 deaths by severe intoxication every year, and more than 90% of deaths occur in developing countries. The contact with pesticides and their consumption can cause chronic illnesses and cancer. Deforestation is also on the rise. The deforestation of the Amazon forest rose 60% compared to the same period last year. Only in 2019, fires and tree logging have already caused the destruction of 912 square kilometers of the vegetation in the Amazon. The National Institute for Space Research reported that the Amazon forest lost 762 square kilometers of native vegetation in June 2019. The deforestation in the Amazon forest might be the double as the amount reported, says a study by an American university accessed by BBC News Brazil. According to the study, the Brazilian Amazon lost an area equivalent to Germany between 2000 and 2017. President Bolsonaro's positive ratings of popularity have plummeted over his first 7 months in the office. Still, he finds support from southern states in the country, particularly from the upper class. The approach of this new policy was expressed over 7 months of confrontations, lower expectations for the economy, and defeats in votes in the Congress. In an effort to pass the pension fund reform on its first vote in the Congress, the government approved vote buying as a strategy. That was very criticized during his campaign and labeled as old politics actions. About 2.5 billion were approved for amendments in order to approve the pension fund reform. Added to other amendments released since March, that amount reaches 4 billion reais. The president's stance on social participation through advisory councils and committees is clear. The less people expressing their opinions or interfering in government actions, the better. In the last months, Bolsonaro has continuously extinguished those institutions under allegations that it will allow the government to work. The 700 existing deliberation organizations are to be reduced to 32, with no social participation, no education, and no science. President Jair Bolsonaro showed once again that education is not one of the priorities for his federal government. In the end of April, the Minister of Education, Abraham Weintraub, announced a 30% cut on investments in federal universities with the excuse of prioritizing primary education. But those cuts affect more than higher education. According to the data from the Budget and Planning Integrated System, the total spending freeze for investments in education surpasses 7 billion reais. In primary education, the amount reaches 914 billion. Cuts include money to build and renovate schools and daycares, professional training, food, and transportation. Half of the federal universities will suffer with cuts above 30% in their budgets. For some, cuts will reach 50% of the funds responsible for maintenance, acquisition of supplies, outsourced services, and scholarships for students, and also for academic research. When the cuts were announced, there were acts in more than 200 cities in all states and the federal district. In June, the Supreme Court ruled that the discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity is to be considered a crime in Brazil. Despite that advance, Brazil has followed the stance of countries majorly Muslim, many of which under authoritarian governments, different from most European and Western nations, in many votes about sexual rights and women's rights in the most important organ of the human rights in the UN. Brazil registered the death of 141 LGBT individuals between January and May this year, according to a report by the Bahia Gay Group, which means one death every 23 hours. According to the Atlas of Violence 2019, Brazil holds the world's record for lethal violence. 14% of the homicides in the world happen in Brazil, and 75% of homicide victims in Brazil are black. The number of women killed by firearms in households rose 28.7%. 4,936 women were murdered in 2017, the highest rate in 10 years. 13 women killed per day. Bolsonaro has also taken steps towards the extinction of the agrarian reform. Memos sent to the administration of the Agrarian Reform Department determined the ceasing of the purchase and demarcation of lands indefinitely. Bolsonaro also reinforced his position against the laicity of the Brazilian state by saying that one of the Supreme Court ministers he's entitled to nominate will be terribly Protestant.
Quantos tentam nos deixar de lado dizendo que o Estado é laico? O Estado é laico, mas nós somos cristãos. Nós somos terrivelmente cristãos. E esse espírito deve estar presente em todos os poderes.
In the March of Daisies, which gathered more than 100,000 women in Brasilia, Protestant women associated to FIACT Brazil replied to that statement, declaring themselves terribly Protestant and feminist, and they joined the march to criticize the Bolsonaro government. The president also shocked the country by affirming that hunger in Brazil is a lie. However, the UN data say otherwise. According to a 2018 report on food and nutrition safety in Latin America and the Caribbean released last year by the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, 5.2 million people suffered with hunger in Brazil between 2015 and 2017. Brazil is experiencing the collapse of the rule of law and a threat to its frail democracy. A long cycle of inequalities has begun. As we edit this video, our home, the Amazon, burns as the planet watches in shock. So far, the Bolsonaro government has taken no measures to fight the fire. Closing our eyes to the crumbling of institutions in Brazil would be crime-like complicity.